So we're going to get started. I'm going to ask you guys, I'm really echoey. Do you want me to turn off the lapel? Do you want me to turn off the lapel?
No, that's the web.
Oh.
That's the way it's set up. I just realized that.
Okay. Is that better? Still getting an echo. How about now? Can you hear me twice? Is it better? Should I sing a song? All right. So we're going to get started. If you're sitting at the back, come on up and have a seat at the front. Only because there's a small group. We had a few more people registered for today's session, but I guess they opted for sunshine instead of us. We won't take offense, though. But we're hoping to keep today pretty casual conversation-wise. So if you want to have a seat closer up, when we get into the panel discussion and the Q&A, we can feel like we're having a chat around the kitchen table instead of in a big old room. Nobody's moving, but that's okay. Maybe you'll come up later. Welcome to this afternoon's Synergy session, Come From Away and Stay, Stories of Newcomers Making Rural Newfoundland and Labrador Home. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Emergency exits are at the back of the room, and then you can exit through the main doors off the atrium or downstairs. The muster station is in the upper parking lot by the dumpsters. We won't need that though. There's a single stall washroom just at the end of this hallway, but there's also more washrooms if you go into the main lobby area and then follow the signage off the main doors. Please turn off your cell phones, or at least turn them to silent. And we'll be taking some photos during the session. Let us know if you don't want us to use those. And we'll also be webcasting for the session today. Before we get started, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we are gathered as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. We would like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuhivut, and the Innu of Nitassinan, and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. The format for today's session is we have about 25 minutes for our speaker. And after the initial presentation, we'll have a panel discussion for another 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions with the members of the audience. For folks watching online, you're welcome to submit your questions at any time during the session. Simply email them in. You can email Justin Deering at jdeering, that's DEARING @mun.ca, and we'll read them out during the Q&A. As I mentioned, this afternoon's session is about immigration in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. And I would like to acknowledge the excellent work of the Public Policy Forum of Canada in helping us bring this session to life. It would not be possible without their Immigration and Atlantic Revitalization Project. The lead for that project, Charlie Carter, is here today. Hi. The project on the whole is looking at what impact immigration can have on the labor market in Atlantic Canada, and given the population challenges of the regions and what steps the regions might take to make that happen. The first stage of the project looked at immigration and retention, and this is where today's presenter comes in. Kelly Tohill is an award-winning journalist and journalism educator whose writing focuses on immigration. She's an associate professor in the School of Journalism at the University of King's College and a past reporter and editor of the Toronto Star. She is the founder and principal of Polestar Immigration Research, and she was asked by the Public Policy Forum to compile a report that looked at the human story. She traveled through Atlantic Canada and talked to people who aren't just statistics in a demographic shift, but who are living its effects and building a home in rural communities. So it is my pleasure now to turn things over to Kelly.
Hello. First of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I am honored and frankly more than a little bit intimidated to be here because I have never lived in Newfoundland and Labrador. I am not from Newfoundland and Labrador, and although I have been to this province dozens of times on various reporting trips, and I have had the privilege of exploring it for various publications, um, this is not my lived experience. So thank you for coming to listen to my observations. Um, I do take that as an honor. Um, am I getting a feedback? No? Okay. So I'm a journalist. I was the Atlantic Canada Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star for a long time, and I'm a tenured faculty member at the University of King's College. And in 2016, I shifted my research stream and started writing exclusively about immigration for various media outlets. I decided this is what I wanted to spend the next 20 years exploring. So I'm dwelling on my background because I suspect you haven't had a lot of journalists at the podium at Synergy sessions. And our research methodology is significantly different than the methodology used by social science researchers, data researchers, market researchers, and my fellow academics. So we do several things. We plumb public data sets for meaning. We synthesize academic research on a topic. And most of all, we talk to people. So I spend a huge amount of my time just talking to people about their lives, or I should say, listening to people talk about their lives. And sometimes, pretty frequently, I literally knock on strangers' doors. So the Public Policy Forum approached me to do a project about immigration in Atlantic Canada almost 2 years ago. And they asked me to do journalism for them, recognizing, I hope, that the journalism methodology has value in discussing and developing public policy. So I have been traveling around Atlantic Canada for the last 18 months, trying to figure out how newcomers fit into the cultural, social, and economic life of the region, and what are the factors that convince them to stay. And I really want to thank the Public Policy Forum for giving me the opportunity to explore this important and fascinating topic in depth. Also, they are now publishing a series of newsletters about immigration in Atlantic Canada. And if you would like to be added to the distribution list for those newsletters, just send me an email or buttonhole Charlie on the way out, or, Google Public Policy Forum Atlantic. So one of the first places I went when I was given this really fascinating task, one of the first trips I made was to the south coast of Labrador last January, because who wouldn't want to go to Labrador in January? But before I tell you what I found, I want to tell you why I chose Labrador, because my mandate was all four provinces. Why did I want to go there? So as I suspect most of the people in this room understand at a very deep level, we in Atlantic Canada, all four provinces really are facing a demographic bomb. Birth rate is declining, population is aging. That is true for all of Canada, but Atlantic Canada is on the bleeding edge of that phenomenon. And you could make a pretty good argument that that issue is most acute in Newfoundland. More people have died in Newfoundland than were born here every year since 2014. And yeah, I haven't looked at the updated statistics, but I believe Newfoundland still has the oldest median age in the country. So the Harris Center did really interesting work on population projections. And that really caught my eye. They said that some parts of Newfoundland and Labrador could lose 30% of its population within not too long. That's a pretty dramatic statistic. And the south coast of Labrador was one of those areas with very, very difficult population projections. So that's why I wanted to go there. So I did. So what I found when I got there was, in addition to sharing the overall difficulties of the province's demographic profile, the south coast of Labrador is dealing with the fallout of Muskrat Falls. So you wouldn't think that highly paid jobs would be a problem, but highly paid jobs in Muskrat Falls had drained those south coast towns of entry-level labor. So basically what I was told by many, many people is that a generation was gone, that People had left for Muskrat Falls. They'd made enormous amounts of money. It was extremely unlikely that they were going to come back to their hometowns and start earning much less money at entry-level wages. So I was in Lancy Loop, Lancy-Clare, Fort Howe, and I talked to everyone I could find. I talked to shop owners and hotel managers and employees, hotel employees, high school teachers, retail cooks, truck drivers, snowmobile salesmen, snowmobile mechanics, nurse, a politician, people who ran the ferry. So when I got there, and this was January of 2018, Labrador was well into its first wave, I would say, of significant immigration. Although many of the people, newcomers I spoke to had been there several years, very few of them had achieved permanent residency yet. So they were still tied to the region by their jobs. The way the immigration programs worked, if they wanted to become permanent residents, they really had to stay. But most said that was fine with them. They wanted to stay, and that they had come to really like this place, and they planned to stay even when they had the freedom to leave. So I interviewed people in those small towns who came from the Philippines, Tunisia, Morocco, Sri Lanka, Dubai, and Cameroon. I might have missed a couple of countries in there. I think it was more than that. It was a lot. It was a very multicultural trip. As an example, more than 10% of the students in the local school were children of immigrants. So what I found in Labrador was a real excitement about newcomers that at a level that I frankly have not seen elsewhere yet. And I continue to travel around Atlantic Canada. This project is ongoing. Thank you, Charlie. So over and over again, I heard local residents tell me they were grateful for the presence of newcomers, that their town would be dying if newcomers hadn't shown up. It wasn't just a grudging recognition that they were useful. It was an emotional gratitude. And I remember there was one particular moment that sticks in my mind. I was having lunch at Dot's Bakery, and it happened to be lunch period at the local school as well. And off to one side of the bakery, there were some teenagers doing tricks with snowmobiles that I really hope I never see ever again in my whole life. As the mother of two children, I couldn't look. But the people I was having lunch with said, no, you really have to look. You have to look at who those kids are. And I looked and I realized that I think there were 6 or 7 teenagers, and they were doing huge jumps and horrible things. 3 of them were newcomers, and 4 of them were children who had grown up in that community. And the kind of game that they were playing, they appeared to be absolutely and completely integrated in this insane endeavor. And I was impressed by that. And then I looked out the window, and there were a couple of girls walking up the street, and they were 11-year-old girls who were friends in the way that I think only 11-year-old girls can be. They were holding hands, and they were leaning into each other, and they were giggling as they walked up the street. Remember, one had a pink coat, one had a purple coat, and one also had a long black braid and a bindi on her forehead. The other one was bright blonde and fair. Next door, I went to the grocery store next door, and I realized that all of the clerks had bindis on their forehead in this teeny town. And then I went to Riff's department store, and I asked a redheaded clerk if she had grown up there, and she said yes. And I said, there are a lot of newcomers, and this is a small town. How is that? How's it going? She smiled, and she said, well, I'm about to marry one of them. And I said, okay. So I went to go find the other clerk, because somebody had told me there were 2 clerks there, and the other clerk was from Cameroon. So the person who took me to Dots was a woman, a very generous woman named Lisa Davis Ryland. She's a youth counselor whose own family had become very tightly bound and connected to a family from Tunisia. So this is a selfie taken by Ryan Ati with his brothers, Omar, who was then 5, and Ali, who was 3, in English Point, Labrador. Has anybody ever been to English Point, Labrador? Okay, it's pretty small, huh? It is a hamlet that's actually in between Lancy-Loup and Lancy-Clare. So the Addies came from Tunisia. Their father got a job driving a transport for a company in Forteau and boarded with Lisa's mother, Rita Davis, for 2 years before he was able to bring his family over. And his wife's name was Reem, and these are his 3 boys. So Reem, I met with Reem and the boys. Helmi was actually traveling, so I didn't meet the dad. But Reem told me that Rita, who was 80 years old, had really become her mother, and she referred to her as mom. And Lisa told me that Reem had become her best friend. Not one of her best friends, but her best friends. And their sons became best friends. So Lisa, Lisa took the boys out to their camp, taught them to hunt. Rita regularly babysat Omar and Ali. It was an extraordinarily tight blend of families. So I had a personal impression that Labrador was welcoming and it was integrating newcomers in an unusual way. I have since discovered that's actually borne out a little bit by academic research. So I don't know how many people here have looked at the Canadian Index for Measuring Integration. This is a project of the Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration. And this is just, this is a screenshot of their interactive website. So it measures how newcomers fare in Canada compared to Canadian-born residents in each jurisdiction. And it analyzes newcomer integration using 4 dimensions: economic, social, civic participation, and access to healthcare. And each dimension includes several variables. For example, the economic index includes information about wage rates, unemployment, labor participation, and other variables. So the data is gathered primarily from the census and the general social survey and also ethnic diversity surveys. It does not include the IMDb tax database, nor does it include other administrative databases. So guess what? According to this index, Newfoundland and Labrador is the 4th most integrated province in the country when it comes to integrating newcomers into society. So what this measures really is the differences between newcomers and their neighbors, not the differences really between newcomers in St. John's and newcomers in Toronto. It's how they fare compared to their neighbors. So according to this index, Newfoundland and Labrador would be doing a better job integrating newcomers than, say, Ontario or British Columbia. So do you know which, I thought it was fascinating which factor of these 4 factors, economic, social, civic, and health, which factor was driving Newfoundland's high ranking in this index? Social. It was social integration that was, and of course I love this statistic because it bears out what I saw in Newfoundland. So it's, confirmation bias here. But it does support what I found. So here's the definition of social integration in this index. This dimension of integration measures immigrants' sense of belonging, social networks, and well-being. Newfoundland is #1 in the country for social integration of newcomers, according to this index. If you dig down a little bit, you discover that the key metric driving this is a sense of belonging to the local community. Not so much the province or Canada, but to the local community. So you've got 87% of immigrants in Newfoundland who felt a strong connection, a strong sense of belonging to their local community. That is far higher than the Canadian average. So I wanted to dig a little bit further and see if I could parse out anything about rural Newfoundland and Labrador. If this was a St. John's phenomenon. This index does not break out rural experience, but it does break out St. John's. And it turns out St. John's has the highest social integration of immigrants, according to this index, of any city in Canada. 84% of immigrants feel a strong sense of belonging to their local community in St. John's. Okay, so 84% feel a strong sense of belonging. 84% of immigrants feel a strong sense of belonging to their local community in St. John's. But if you look at the provincial average, 87% overall. That means that the sense of belonging in rural Newfoundland It's actually higher than in St. John's. Yeah. So remember, St. John's has the highest social integration of any city in Canada. And according to these stats, rural Newfoundland is doing better than St. John's on this one metric. And it is just one metric. But social integration is important. So this aligns with research done by others showing that rates of discrimination in Atlantic Canada are lower than rates in Ontario, BC, and the prairies. So this does also look at victims of discrimination in the past 5 years, and I didn't put the slide up, so I don't want to pretend that there's no discrimination anywhere. And this particular index found that immigrants in Newfoundland in the last 5 years, about 36% had experienced discrimination. However, again, that was lower than the national average, significantly lower than the national average. So Labrador is not the only place I've been knocking around asking questions. I've also spent time listening to immigration stories in Moncton, Fredericton, St. John, Woodstock, Heartland, Chipman, in New Brunswick, Clare County in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Charlottetown, Borden, PEI. I've got a long itinerary ahead of me too, yay. And I have found many other interesting projects and experiences. So for instance, I spent a long time at a synagogue in St. John that's been key to restoring that city's vanishing Jewish community. And I spent a day in a beef processing plant in PEI, which is doing some pretty interesting things with settlement as far as employers are concerned. But I really haven't sensed anything like the level of integration in other communities that I did in Labrador. So here's where I veer into pure speculation. So what I'm about to say is really based on my observations. I'm pretty good at observing, but it is my observations. This is not empirical research. And I see 4 strengths to the experience of immigration in rural Labrador that may not exist everywhere else. And I also think it's extremely important to recognize that rural immigration is not a homogenous issue or trend. Each community is different. And it would be the height of urban hubris to pretend that, one solution that happens to suit Bayvert is also going to suit Bathurst. So back to the strengths. Company size. So in Labrador, newcomers in the towns that I was in, the newcomers were all brought to town by small employers. And this may seem like a paradox because larger employers have resources to develop HR policies and HR systems and do things methodically and professionally. But they also may lose the intimacy with their newcomer employees that other small employers have. So I have visited quite a few towns where large numbers of immigrants were brought in to work at a single employer. And despite some really excellent settlement services, they continue to be isolated. They live together, eat together, travel together, and work together. And even if the employer picks them up at the airport, provides transportation, takes them shopping trips and community activities, still tend to be isolated from the surrounding community. In Labrador, the employers that I talked to knew everything about their newcomer employees. They knew the names of their relatives back in whatever country they came from. One woman knew exactly what songs one of her employees had learned on the guitar that week. He wasn't learning them at work, he was learning them at home. So there was an intimacy to the relationship. And also, mostly the newcomers weren't working in large cohorts. They were working singly, in pairs, or in threes. So they really had to get to know the Canadians around them. There wasn't much other option. They couldn't stay just within a group. The second issue, and this may really get me in trouble because I am about to generalize about Newfoundland and Labrador experience and culture. I'm apologizing in advance for that as someone who is not from here. But I do believe that rural Newfoundland may be more cosmopolitan than many other rural areas in the world. There are a couple of reasons for that. And the culture itself in rural Labrador may have been more open to newcomers. generations of people from Newfoundland and Labrador have been leaving this province for work and coming back. I mean, that has been happening since the era of tall ships. And they aren't just traveling to other parts of Canada, they are traveling around the world and have been, as I said, for generations. So I do think that people in this part of the world are more transient and understand the need to be transient, and also, frankly, have more experience with the rest of the world than many other parts of rural Canada. The other thing that I thought about, and that was mentioned a few times in Labrador to me, is that although many rural communities are facing this demographic bomb, there is a historic memory in Newfoundland of what it's like to actually shut towns down. So it's very different to think, oh, theoretically, perhaps a town could die, but that's actually happened in this province. And people understand how much pain is involved in that. So it's I think, a realer threat in Newfoundland and Labrador than perhaps other parts of Atlantic Canada or Canada. Okay, I'm just going to stop generalizing about Newfoundland and Labrador now. The other thing, and this might be a little controversial, is that the lack of settlement services. So now there is somebody in Fort Howe, which I think is fabulous, but there wasn't when I was there. I think I must have been there 3 weeks or so before that person was put in place. But I'm wondering if the lack of settlement services really forced the community to step up and help newcomers because they knew nobody else was going to take up that slack. I'm not suggesting that settlement services aren't useful and needed. They most obviously are. But there is some research, particularly from Stacey Wilson-Forsberg, suggesting newcomers can form stronger bonds in communities where there are no settlement services. Fourth, immigration was new on the South Coast. There was a novelty to the newcomers that I think invited curiosity and contact. So this week, I checked in with many of those I interviewed last year. What I found is that several of the people who said they planned to stay in Labrador did not. I also found that that is affecting how some of the Labradorians that I interviewed view newcomers. So I talked to Tyrone Normore. So Tyrone had hired 2 mechanics from Tunisia to fix snowmobiles. He runs the Skidoo dealership. And they were lovely men, really interesting, very well educated. And they had a picture of, I didn't put this in my notes, but I think it's Die Another Day, some James Bond movie. They had a poster of the movie up on the wall because the only Skidoo they had ever seen in their lives before arriving in Labrador was in that movie. They liked the movie a lot, but I loved the sense of irony of putting the poster up on the wall. So Tyrone told me these mechanics had worked for him for about 4 years. After they got their permanent residency, they gave him 2 weeks notice. One went to Toronto and the other went to Fort Mac. He doesn't think they're earning more money, but he thinks they left because they wanted a bigger city and they wanted easier travel, because it is hard to get to and from the south coast of Labrador. But what he said to me was, it was an emotional reaction. He said, actually what he said was, I feel a bit burned. Should have put a bit in there. He said, I feel a bit burned. And what had impressed me was the emotional connection that people in these towns had to people coming in. So Helmi, Reem, Omar, Ryan, and Ali also left Labrador. And they now live in Laval, just outside Montreal. So I contacted Reem, and she told me that the family moved to Quebec because it cost them too much to visit Tunisia from Labrador, that she wanted to stay in touch with her relatives in Tunisia. There are 5 of them, and it was just too hard to get to Tunisia and back from Labrador. I also talked to Lisa Davis Ryland yesterday, and she still FaceTimes Reem every other day. And her family is traveling to Montreal next week to go visit. They are still very close. But she said it was really painful to watch them go. She said it hurt her 80-year-old mother, and it really hurt her 6-year-old son when his best friend left. And this is what she said. She said, I would never want to go through that again. I swear I will never befriend another foreign family. So I suspect if I return to the south coast of Labrador tomorrow, I might not find the same level of excitement that I found a year ago. And I think it's really important to note that neither Lisa nor Tyrone have become anti-immigrant in any way. They both still recognize that without newcomers, their town's going to die. And they're still grateful to people who are showing up in town and want them to succeed. But they both told me they don't want to invest emotionally in people who show up. I don't know how fresh this hurt is, so I don't know if that vow will stay, but I think it's important to note. So there is a lot of literature showing that welcoming communities affect retention, as do economic prospects and cultural security. People are more likely to stay where they can earn a wage, where they feel included, and where they have cultural, religious, or family ties. That's deep academic research shows that, and common sense tells you that. Several researchers are using tax records to look at retention rates by country of origin. And it's interesting, there are really startlingly different retention rates in different provinces by country of origin. So the people who tend to stay in Newfoundland are from different countries than the people who tend to stay in Nova Scotia. For instance, I've been doing a lot of research around international students, and in Newfoundland for several years, students from Bangladesh, the retention of Bangladeshi students outstripped every other group, outstripped Indians, Chinese, anyone else. And Tyrone has recognized this. He said he really wants mechanics now from the Philippines. He's hoping to find a mechanic with a family from the Philippines because his experience in looking around the South Coast is that people from the Philippines are more likely to stay. Tax records suggest that he's right. So some of the most interesting ideas that I have heard about immigration retention in Atlantic Canada have come from newcomers themselves. And three themes have emerged in discussions with newcomers, not just in Newfoundland and Labrador, but also in the other three provinces. And I'm going to convey these. They aren't my ideas. I'm not necessarily endorsing them, but I think they're worth adding to the discussion because I am hearing them over and over. I've had several people tell me, basically to lower the bar, that they don't ever want to hear the phrase best and brightest again. What they said to me was, newcomers are by nature ambitious people. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of organization to leave your country. And I've had several people tell me that the most ambitious people are unlikely to stay in smaller regions. That if an immigrant's goal is fame or money or status, retention is going to be harder in Atlantic Canada because of those things. There's a perception that those things will be easier to find in larger cities. So maybe actually not recruiting for the best and the brightest. The other thing I've heard over and over again, I have no idea how you fit this into policy, but it has been probably half of the people who have stayed have mentioned this to me, is that they have a connection to nature. Not everybody has a connection to nature. Probably not even most people have that. I have no idea if there is a way to screen for that, but it seems to be a factor in retention in my interviews. Finally, the dominant worry that I hear from newcomer families, in particular in Atlantic Canada, is about the quality of primary and high school education for their children. So much of the literature suggests that, or not much, but some of the literature suggests that children in the public education system in Atlantic Canada don't do as well as children in the public education system in Ontario and British Columbia. Most parents immigrate hoping to create a better future for their children. So it's the factors that affect those children's future, or that they perceive will affect those children's future, not their own, that's going to influence their decision about whether to stay. So both of the mechanics who left Normore's Skidoo dealership and also Helmy had all been living on the South Coast for 4 years before they left. It's quite a while. And I talked to some people just yesterday, actually, who said, you know, what is a reasonable expectation for retention? Retention is not just an immigration issue. We have a retention issue with our own children and our own population. And that conversation can't necessarily be divorced. Do we expect every person who arrives in a rural community to stay there forever? Because it's not an expectation we have for the people who were born there. So what is good retention? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it multi-generational? Do we need to change our expectations about that? There's an expectation that rural physicians are not necessarily going to stay forever. That's sort of built into the policy now, that they will be here. I think it's 2 years in some jurisdictions. So I want to leave you with a slide that just shows you some of the current stats. So more than half of the immigrants who came to Newfoundland in 2011 were still here 5 years later. You know, half stayed. Also, newcomers to Newfoundland and Labrador do quite well economically. Their wages are higher and their unemployment rates are lower than in many other areas of the province. And depending on which path they came through, in some cases they are higher, wages are higher than people who were born here. There's new research that confirms old research, which confirms common sense, showing that immigrants who arrive with children are much more likely to remain in Newfoundland than immigrants who arrive alone or just with a partner. And I just want to stress that that index information again, that Newfoundland has the highest social integration of immigrants of any province in Canada, and the 4th highest level of integration overall. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Kelly, for that. I left my cell phone up here, but looks like we're only running about 10 minutes, 10 minutes over. I would now like to ask our panelists to join us on the couches up here in the front. And Kelly, you can join them as well. The panel, we have Sanchita Chakraborty. She was born in Bangladesh, raised in East India, and now calls St. John's home. She holds a law degree from the University of Calcutta and came to Newfoundland as an international student to pursue gender studies and criminology at Memorial University. Sanchita has worked with the Association for New Canadians for the past 9 years as a settlement worker in schools and now as a diversity officer. As a public educator and advocate for diversity, she is committed to the mission of developing and promoting awareness, education, and appreciation for strengthening and diversifying our community. Along with her degrees and well-known unique presentation style within the community sector, Sanchita is most proud of obtaining Canadian citizenship and her Canadian passport. That does deserve applause. Ken Walsh is also joining us there on the couch. Ken has held the position of Senior Settlement Coordinator with the Association for New Canadians Western Regional Office in Corner Brook since its establishment in January 2018, so last year. Ken has been involved in the settlement sector for over 10 years, and prior to his current role on the west coast of the island, has served as a researcher, program manager, and private sponsorship of refugee program coordinator with the organization. Dr. Kathleen Perwick is also there, and she's the Community Collaboration and Development Officer with Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador. Kathleen supports MNL's extensive municipal advocacy, policy, and practice-related efforts through research, content development, outreach, and education activities for the organization's 276 member municipalities. In addition to a dozen or more other things, she is also overseeing MNL's Welcome NL program, a community-facing initiative that seeks to dispel myths and misinformation about immigration and otherwise educate Newfoundlanders and Labradorians about the ways we can be more welcoming to newcomers. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to take a seat over here. Hi, guys. And I'm going to move a little bit. There we go. All right. So I guess first off, first impressions, first responses. I know Kelly's presentation really struck many chords with me. It was eye-opening in lots of different ways. So from your experiences, I'm sure you must have lots more to say even. So do you think the stories and challenges that she outlined ring true in your experience? Maybe Sanchita, do you want to start? There's microphones there on the couch. You might have to flick it on. You do for online. Actually, anyone
Okay.
listening
Well,
online won't hear you
hello?
without a mic.
Can you hear me? Okay. Kelly, first of all, wow, that was, I was just telling my colleague that time, Sherry, she also works with me at the NC. I was telling her, like, these are, like, of course, look like, kind of like, because the work we do, sounded like, looked like as we knew about it, but some of the notes and the key statement there you hit, especially with stories and the stat, felt like to me, wow, this is actually really, this is how I wanted to tell this to the audience, during my presentation, and this is one of the greatest one about the retention that you talked about. How the connection with the local community, mainly that newcomers feel, that is so true. My parents just visited me from Bangladesh just a month ago, and they lived here for 6 months. They were just visiting, and when they went back, I took them back with me when I went there as well last month. My dad was talking all about Newfoundland, the people, how good and how well civic senses they have in Newfoundland. Beautiful people, so polite. Why can't we learn that in Bangladesh? With his relatives, and so all the credit. But he did not say Newfoundland, Newfoundland. He was saying Canada, Canada, Canada. So all the credit from Newfoundland, he was giving it to Canada, which is okay because it's the same country. But again, that's where I felt like, yes, they felt that local connection with all my friends came over, or over the years with my integration here in Newfoundland, the friend circle, the connection I made, they all met them, and that's what they felt about this place. Regarding my lived experience or anything, you want me to tell, or later on?
I can ask that later on. We can move on and see what Ken has
Yes.
to say about the presentation.
Sure. Firstly, I can kind of empathize with you about your trip to Labrador. I moved to Nain, which is on coastal Labrador, in January, with 2 dogs and 2 cats, to join my partner there for a year. So it was an interesting trip up there, but it was beautiful. And I think it was really interesting to see some of the real small town perspective from Labrador, which I don't think has been reflected in any of the studies that I've seen. So it was neat to get some firsthand experience from there. I didn't realize that we were actually first. I've gotten feedback from some of the clients I've seen and talked about why they're staying here. They've come through various streams, whether it's through the Atlantic Immigration Pilot, the provincial nominee program as international students, and that is one of the main things that they say is that sense of community that they get here. So it was neat to see that kind of reflected in your research and your work.
Yeah, I had a similar response. When I first came to this province, I'm not a Newfoundlander originally. It was back in 1989, and I was doing planning work in Labrador. So I had opportunities to watch very scary things being done with skidoos. Actually, we can probably compare notes. but yeah, there were many residences there for me. Just the experience of this as a place where there are many dimensions to the friendliness and the experience of welcome. But I think the thing that really stuck with me was that number about, still a third experiencing discrimination. And these are the things that, as we get involved in the Welcome NL program, it's a steep learning curve, figuring out a lot of the nuances and the sensitivities that exist, within the immigration sphere, and the whole domain of, microaggressions, and, the work to be able to start building awareness, because it is like an onion, sort of start with some very basic principles around, what it is to be welcoming. And then you start going deeper and peeling off another layer and another layer, and so I'm really particularly interested in those other dimensions.
I'm going to ask Ken the first official question. We've been talking about outmigration in Newfoundland and Labrador, and certainly across Atlantic Canada for decades or longer. And I think the general assumption, and Kelly, you touched on this as well, is that for newcomers, there's always a draw to a more urban center. But in your experience, I know Corner Brook has lots of urban flavor as well. But certainly, some of the people that you work with there are based in smaller towns. Has that experience been for you? And is that what you're seeing, or is that draw to more urban happening, or is there something that rural has to offer for newcomers in Newfoundland?
Well, yeah. Well, I work in the Corner Brook office, so we have a regional scope. Each one of our satellite offices has kind of a regional scope. So we're very kind of hub and spoke. So the hub would be the actual office itself, but we're often reaching out to some of the more rural and remote centers around us and communities around us. I mean, I think the draw is still there for urban centers, and I think there's a couple reasons for that, just based on sheer numbers. That's where the jobs are. So if people are coming here for employment, they may end up in urban centers before a smaller center. The other reason behind that would be for government-assisted refugees. So if you're a government-assisted refugee, you will be destined to a larger center, simply because that's where the settlement services that IRCC funds to provide to newcomers are located in most cases. But that being said, we are experiencing the same type of demographic shifts and the same type of labor shortages that are experienced in larger centers, as you mentioned, probably more so or felt more intensely in smaller centers. So I am seeing a large number of folks coming through our office and across the region for employment purposes. We're seeing a lot of folks coming through as international students in campuses like Munnick Grenfell in Corner Brook. And there's advantages to living there. I mean, you kind of touched on a few as well, but I think you can see your dollar kind of stretch a little bit further, maybe, right? So rent is a little bit lower in smaller centers. I think with initiatives like Welcome NL and with the establishment of our satellite offices there, I think they have more access to those type of supports that they need to kind of thrive and be successful there.
Yeah. Sanchita, you've been living in the province now for 15 years or so. And you've even started 18 now? Oh, wow. And you've even started a business here as well. By any measure, I think that counts as making this place your home. And I know you describe it that way as well. What made you want to stay here?
I just wanted to say before, it just triggered my mind that time when, when I look back now, 18 years ago, why did I choose this place? Often people ask me this question. And then sometimes I also think this way, that many like myself, I cannot talk for everybody, but for me, if I can speak, and even for a few of us, that I don't think we choose the place chooses us. What I mean by that is, growing up, the dream was definitely for me. I didn't know where Newfoundland was. It was all American dream. It's all North America. Like if you take Canada and US, it's all America. Growing up, watching Tom Cruise and Julia Roberts' was that movie Sleeping with the Enemy. That was my time movie. And I'm just giving away my age right now to you guys. Those were like, it's all Hollywood. So when I first arrived in St. John's, to me, I thought my flight took me to the wrong direction. I took the wrong flight. This is not where I was coming. I didn't know. But again, so then what happens then? Have you guys ever seen this movie Castaway, Tom Hanks? Yeah. They just replay that movie so many times. So it's one of my most favorite movies. There's a scene, and this is just recently. Since with my integration here and so long I've been here now, I constantly think like, what? Again, I'm trying to answer it because I don't have the exact answer for that question. So I'm just trying to use all this metaphor. So there was a scene where Tom Hanks, finally he made his boat to jump across that biggest wave. And then when he successfully did that, he was looking back at that island, which was his home for alone, although there was nothing but coconut and coconut water. Although it was miserable for him, although it was horrible for him, even though he looked at that island and he shredded tears. That is the connection for many newcomers or who already are integrated and retained in a place. It's still, I'm still searching for that. Like, is it that place that brings me to say that that's my home, or is this is my home? So
Constantly torn.
there's a huge tug of war going on, emotional. Doesn't matter how horrible your situation was.
Mm.
Even for many refugees, I would say it's the same thing. How bad the situation was, how bad. It's never the country was bad, it's the situation was, and still there is that connection of why did I stay back. Is, again, I don't think I chose this place, but the place chose me. And with time, when you graduate and you become self-aware more, about the community, then your social community grows, um, and then the sense of belonging starts from there. Plus, employment plays a huge role of it. But again, if I go back to Kelly's point, the sense of belonging starts from the community itself. um, that's when I started my dance business. I wanted to open. I did learn dancing back in India, where I grew up, part of my life, and so I wanted to do something. I just wanted to dance. I wanted to share my whatever I had with me at that time. So I opened a school called East Meets West. This is, I'm talking about 16, 17 years ago now, and nobody showed up. Nobody really gave it a I don't know. They did, of course, it's something like new things for them. And then a few days later, I kind of thought about it and I changed the name. I'm like, how about we call it, you know, Bollywood Jig? I think I went with one of my friends in this Irish pub in downtown, Tapper John or something like that. Tapper John. And that's where I heard my friends were saying, "This is jig, this is jig." So I'm like, "What is jig?" And then they said, "This is our Newfoundland." And then I said, "You just the other day you taught me jig's dinner, and now you're saying jig music, jig dancing." So there's a big connection with jig and our own Irish local, community. And Bollywood comes from the overseas. So I'm like, maybe something I would I would change the name. And then one girl came finally. That's also from Twillingate. She became my best friend because she stayed back to my dance school. Two of us started. And then within like a year, I would say, or 8, 9 months, um, I think so far I taught over 300 students so far, Some of them are like they stayed back. So I think it's the small thing, that name change and how you connect. Not just, my brother always say one wonderful thing. It's not what that place has for you, what you have for that place as well.
Mm.
So the contribution is very
Yeah,
important.
that
both
mutual
ways.
contribution. That's great. You also work as a settlement worker.
Diversity.
A diversity worker.
Training officer. Yeah.
Eh, but mostly here in St. John's. Do you think the experience for people here in St. John's is vastly different from someone in rural Newfoundland and Labrador? Or do you?
I think I keep going back to Kelly's presentation and what she said.
That's okay. We're supposed to do that.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Kelly, I'm stealing your ideas here. Um, I think rural Newfoundland is actually kind of a bit more cosmopolitan. I don't know if that's a generalized idea I'm making again, or I do see that some part of. I've never lived in rural Newfoundland. I've been always a townie here, but I did have opportunities to go to rural Newfoundland during my work term, and with all these presentations, I do go to many part of, and I do see actually there are uh, more openness to. It's just the exposure may not be in that mass, but the interest.
Mhm.
The presentation I do for school, especially if I talk for the school kids, K to 12, tremendous learning interest,
Curiosity.
curiosity. Yeah.
Kelly, or sorry, Kathleen first. Tell us a bit about Welcome NL. I mean, I know you wear many hats at MNL, but just tell us a little bit about that. What that program is and what role municipalities play in the attraction and retention of newcomers. I mean, certainly we're outside of St. John's, very town based, and there's got to be a role for municipalities in all of that. Oh, you need a microphone, no?
This is on, right? Thanks. The project, Welcome NL, is not quite a year and a half old at this stage in the game. So we're definitely on a learning curve. But I think what it reflects is a move that the provincial government has made to broaden the base, of who's actually investing, time, thought, and personal energy in engaging with newcomers and thinking more uh, thinking more deeply about what it is we might want to do ourselves or change about ourselves in order to be more welcoming, because we have seen these trends of issues with retention, the persistence of discrimination, a deeper conversation that needs to happen about racism. It is there, and we really can't ignore it. Especially, I think, in this countdown now to the next federal election and the moves that we're starting to see. Unfortunately, there's yellow vest activity happening, in this town and in this area, and these are signals, that I think we have to respond to and provide leadership and take a stand on. So those are roles for municipal leaders, among other things. Welcome NL was starting out from a base of work that the province had done in the past. There have been welcoming community programs and pilots in the past. We've had immigration action plans for a significant period of time that have had elements of that sort of programming, everything being focused around the idea of retention, addressing retention as distinct now from the actual integration and settlement services that are very much focused on the newcomer themselves, and the mechanisms for bringing newcomers here that the provincial government employs. But in this instance, we're needing to foster a dialogue, not again that resides within the province, where you're sort of hitting those points, but it's been migrated now actually into the municipal sector itself, where we have municipal leaders that can have ownership over the program and can start posing some of the questions, asking for the information that they need in order to be able to shore up the arguments that they need to be able to make when they're faced with critiques and outright misinformation about immigration, about the nature of the newcomer population, and factors that often will shut down a conversation in a public space. And again, this is a fairly sophisticated policy environment. There are a lot of nuances to it, and a lot of our community leaders are not well versed. So, the opportunity to actually give them the talking points that they need to start peeling the onion, if you will, in our sphere, so that the thinking there is a little more sophisticated, and people are starting to connect the dots with what it is they can do, as organizations, as employers, as individuals in their engagements with newcomers that happen to be in their milieu. That's a conversation that I'm really happy has been migrated into our space.
Yeah, and that migration of ownership right to the town level, I think, is really important, and speaks to, again, what Kelly was talking about in terms of in that small towns, people having ownership of newcomers coming in and feeling that sense of responsibility for making sure that the integration happens and people feel settled and at home. I know it's not what you're not supposed to compare siblings, but you've been talking to lots of folks in our sibling provinces, say. And I know you mentioned that Newfoundland and Labrador is doing really well when it comes to integration of newcomers on the national scale. But I don't know if we really feel that way necessarily here on the ground. And we're always looking for best practices, who else is doing stuff that's neat. And I'm wondering if there was anything that you've seen or anything that's kind of come up in any of your other discussions with people in other provinces in Atlantic Canada you think would be something that Newfoundland and Labrador should look at, or something that you don't see here that we could be doing, or?
That's a question that I'm going to have a great answer to at about 8 o'clock tonight.
Nice. Stay tuned. We'll email out your answer.
I think the connector programs, I mean, you do have some of that here, but there's a potential for those programs to actually work in rural areas as well. There were some interesting things happening in Woodstock in New Brunswick, in terms of connecting people and rallying the community around newcomers before they arrive. I'm not sure if there's any evidence of how this is working, but I know also in New Brunswick, some of the employers before anyone arrives they're having sessions. So they're getting the community together, they're getting all of the high school teachers together, they're getting the clergy together and saying, let's talk about the stuff that's difficult to talk about now, let's talk about religious differences, let's get, questions answered so that there's less awkwardness when people actually show up.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure. I can't tell you what kind of impact it's had yet, but I think that was an interesting one.
Okay. I think it's time to open it up to folks on the floor. If anyone has any questions.
Can I also just add one thing?
Yeah.
It relates to something Ken said. I'm crunching some numbers right now, and I think this trend, it was a surprise to me. I think it gets masked because we're seeing so much more immigration in the region generally. But the proportion of newcomers who are destined for rural areas in Atlantic Canada is actually rising. And I had not realized that until I crunched the numbers. So I think that's a relevant part of the conversation.
Yeah. Yep.
Can I just add something? I just thought of mentioning that, but I forgot in the flow and with my what I was saying in the beginning. When I hear this word, like, urban, rural, rural Newfoundland, rural, this place, that place, for me, St. John's is rural. Right.
Yeah, it's
so
it's a fine line.
Exactly. The place I come from, 13,000 people per square kilometer in a city to 3 people per square kilometer in a province as big as the country I come from, So to me, I was doing a chart that time just to save. I'm like, Kathy, maybe we can fix this question. So urban to rural, then to urban, or urban to rural. It was pretty confusing to me when I hear those two words. But I think often it's the especially for newcomers and immigrants, and when we talk about integration, it's not the question of what brought me here. I don't know. I did not know. I'm here, and I'm not here. And chances are there are flight risk, because again, I'm coming from 13,000 people to 3 people. I did not know this, so I may again, and that those big city dream is always there. Those are big challenges. But again, with time, and there are very stages of integration. I think that's what I was trying to say.
Maybe it's a matter of we need to market ourselves a little differently. It's not the big city dream, but it's the open space and the enjoying of nature and all the rest of it. In terms of the rural-urban difference in Newfoundland and Labrador, I always like to think of it, can you drive to Tim Hortons in 15 minutes? Then you're urban. I grew up in Harbour Grace, and you can drive to Bay Roberts or Carbonear and go to a Tim Hortons in either of those towns within 15 minutes. So was that rural? By Newfoundland and Labrador standards, probably not rural enough. But I also spent a lot of time in Buckens, and Buckens, you cannot drive to a Tim Hortons in 15 minutes. The closest one is an hour and 15-ish away. So that definitely counts as rural. So if you're within a 15-minute drive of Tim Hortons. Sure.
We're speaking a lot about people coming here for jobs, but I think it's also important to note that newcomers that come here bring an entrepreneurial spirit with them as well, a lot of new skills. And I think more so in rural centers, they're able to kind of carve out a niche a little bit easier than maybe they could in our urban centers. So even in Corner Brook alone, I mean, we've had 5 privately sponsored families come there since 2015. We have a couple more on the way. 4 of those have stayed. So we have an 80% retention rate, which I'd like to promote for Corner Brook anyway, among our privately sponsored. And 2 of those families opened up their own businesses. And they're thriving. They're doing really well. We have Mo's Corner Barbershop in Corner Brook, and we have Jasmine Syrian Food, which just recently opened up too, and they're doing really well. So I mean, it's important to note that that these folks bring with them that real entrepreneurial spirit, and they can do really well there in their own business and maybe carve and bring something that wasn't there before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Questions? You're right up front and first out of the gate. Just tell everyone your name before you get started and make sure you're using the mic.
I'm Kevin Bennett. I was born in Newfoundland. I guess the reason most of us like to welcome immigrants and we tend to do that. And on your statement with moving away because of proximity to their relatives, I can appreciate that. You know, this island is hard to get from. And I must say in rural Labrador, probably even greater. But I have a question for you, Kelly. And that's one area that a little bit surprised me was on the discrimination area. And I'm just wondering, in what area of discrimination was that portrayed?
So you're talking about the index that I was referring to. So I'm going off the top of my head. I would urge you to go online and look up that index. I'm not involved with that index. It's not my research. I'm just telling you what I've read. And the question, I believe it's from the General Social Survey, is have you experienced personally discrimination within the last 5 years? So it's taken from that survey. It doesn't say what the nature of the discrimination was. I believe it was 36% for immigrants in Newfoundland and Labrador, but the national rate for immigrants was significantly higher. Does that answer your question?
Not really. I was just trying to get to, you know, because I don't see a lot of discrimination in this public. So I'm
Just get you the mic first.
me again. I just that you didn't really answer what I wanted. Like I don't see personally a lot of discrimination here with people. They tend to like everyone. So I was just wondering in what area of discrimination, like was it jobs? Was it they not hired because of language or ethnic background? What is the fine area of discrimination?
Well, I'm going to pass it to you, but I would suggest if you're part of a dominant group, it's hard to see discrimination. So I don't see it the same way somebody else might. But that was not parsed out in this particular data.
No, I'm just going to give a shout out to Prajvala Dixit, who just wrote an excellent piece on exactly those kinds of considerations, you know, because it is a blind spot. You know, if we have the privilege that we do, you know, of, you know, not, I think it is. Yep. Oh, sorry. I'm just really bad with mics. If we have that privilege, it is a blind spot for us. And so I really encourage you to have a look at some of her writing, you know, that opportunity to, you know, hear the story from people who are living the experience of being newcomers, of, you know, consistent, you know, it can be very subtle, the nature of the discrimination that is present, but it is definitely something that is experienced by individuals that are, you know, not part of the dominant cultural group.
I also think that Tony Fang has done some really interesting work on this at Memorial University. So there is some interesting, I can't quote it for you, depends how interested you are, but I would urge you to also look up some of Tony Fang's work.
Like you to meet Prajvala, she's right behind you.
I can just give. I don't know if this will answer the question you had, or yes, we are very lucky to be living in a place like this. As my dad also said, what a wonderful place. Like he was just visiting, and he hasn't also seen much of maybe all of it. Whatever I could show him. Um, I'll give you one quick example for, again, it's not discrimination I'm talking about, but it's always those questions. Sometimes you can sense that behind the scene, there's something else going on. That person or somebody who doesn't want to utter the question, or may not want to showcase, maybe he or she's thinking, oh, will that show my ignorance if I ask this question? And it's okay, it's all right. I always try to tell my audience or the children or the students there, it's okay to ask questions, but don't don't hide the question. Then we don't have the discussion, hence not the discourse anymore. Anyway, so I remember giving this high school student, I think he was in grade 11 or 10, 15 years old, and the reason I remember his age, because he asked me, he wanted to be friendly with me after the presentation. He was like, great presentation, hey Sanchita, nice to meet you. And then he said, so do you like Newfoundland? Do you like Newfoundland? So I'm like, how old are you? And he said, I'm 15. I said, I've been a Newfoundlander for 18 years. You're asking me if I like Newfoundland? Like, I'm more Newfoundlander than you are, my boy, so then I told him, hey, bye, that's it's all in the question. So again, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one for anyone to answer. Again, you may not see it. When I go back to Bangladesh, I feel, and the reason I have my Canadian passport mentioned as an achievement for me in my bio is because you guys, some of you, I'm sure most of you travel a lot outside the country. You would know that, what a privilege that passport is when you're lining up behind 4 people versus 400 people in an airport outside the Canadian border. That's a huge privilege. My accent is a privilege. It's called NRI accent. I don't have the typical traditional Indian accent anymore. Maybe I dropped some, I adopted some, I don't know. I didn't know that. But it's called, they call it NRI accent. And Prajwala knows exactly what I'm talking about. NRI means non-resident Indian, and that's a huge privilege. We literally have a community in India, it's called NRI community, and the house prices there is skyrocketing. Only NRIs can afford it. So these are all the privilege that we don't often see it. It's so hidden there. Again, wonderfully you said that when you are, even I don't see that privilege sometime when I live here, because I'm now in that group of the, which is the predominantly the privileged group that we talk about. So it's sometimes hidden.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Prajwala. I write for the CBC and Saltwire Network. I am a journalist and columnist. I'm an engineer by education. That's me. But to answer your question, sir, it can vary from subtle forms to completely blatant forms. If you were to anglicize your name on a resume, there have been studies that have shown that you get more hits as opposed to going in with your regular name. People do come here and change their names and turn it into anglicized names. That's just the name perspective. But then microaggressions are such they tangle up your mind in such a way that you don't know if there is a racist intent or not. So you can never call them out quite. So that in itself adds so much mental health stuff builds up there in terms of wondering if there is intent or not. But either way, if it's intent or ignorance, either way, when a racial slur comes your way, you're still getting punched, whether there is intent or not. So it's there. Sadly, it pains me to tell you that it's there. It's very much present. And many people don't speak about it for multiple reasons. One, it's the fear of being thrown out of the country. That's very real. Fear that your employer might kick you out of the job. That's very real too. So, and your job might be tied to the status in this country, right? So many people don't talk about it, but that doesn't mean it's not there, right? So yeah, it's different. It's seen different from different perspectives, and I'm sure. I mean, one is definitely race, but the economics plays a huge part too in othering, and economics goes across across color. So you could be a white, poor Newfoundlander and still experience othering, and you could still be a brown immigrant and still experience othering, all due to economic factors, right? So I see it, sadly, and it's present. And I had to answer this. So thank you for listening.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Justin. Hi, Mike Clare, retired citizen. I think it's important that we send people that immigrants go to rural areas, because what we've seen in other jurisdictions is that it's places that don't have immigrants that are so strongly opposed to immigration. In Quebec, it's the rural parts of Quebec that oppose immigration. In England, it was the northern parts of the country that have fewer immigrants that opposed immigration. Because people don't know, they're afraid, they hear stuff on the media, etc. So I applaud everybody who's making it possible for people to go, to get hired and to stay in rural areas. From a provincial perspective, it's really important. Kelly, a question regarding the retention rate, because to my mind, I hear all kinds of retention rates from 30% are staying to 60% are staying. And you quoted 51%. I was just wondering where that number came from.
Statistics Canada.
So should be okay.
Yeah, there are so many different ways to slice and dice the retention figures. But in one of their more recent publications from the Daily, they had a 5-year retention rate based on a 2011 landing in Newfoundland of 51% 5-year retention rate.
5-year.
No, I think that's an overall retention rate, but I think under certain categories we do have a higher retention rate, lower in others, right? So if you look at family class, if you look at economic class, we're looking, I think, around, and Remzi could probably correct me on this, right? But we're looking at around 60%, I think, for economic and family class. I think into the higher 50s, higher 62%. Yeah. So, and we dipped down in a couple others, which I won't mention.
Yeah. And also Newfoundland's lower on retention and refugees than the other provinces of Atlantic Canada. I have no idea why that is, but significantly lower.
I know it's low compared to the rest of Canada when it comes to retention of students as well, but it's higher than other parts of Atlantic Canada too. So it's interesting. It's an interesting conversation about how to when you start diving into those numbers, they really tell all sorts of different stories.
Which anecdotally, I mean, I see a lot of international students come through my office from CNA, from Grenfell, and they really want to stay. So we have a few initiatives that have been funded by the province to help kind of bridge them to work after graduation. I assist a lot of folks with postgraduate work programs, permits. And so I do see that number. I expect to see that rise a little bit, hopefully, in the coming years, maybe when the next stats come
out. I'm going to say, I think we have maybe time for one more question. and I see a hand up. Yeah, we'll take one more. We might have to go a couple of minutes over, but.
Okay. My name is Carrie Neal. I've been working with Dr. Tony Fang for the past few years researching immigration. And we did a project about a year ago looking at refugees and comparing the experience of the Syrian refugees to those who had come in previous years. And we found that the Syrians were actually staying more. They had built a community because so many of them had come at the same time. Whereas in previous years, refugees were kind of coming from all over, arriving at different times, and really weren't able to connect with a community. And that really kind of drove them to move elsewhere. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how, we've been so focused on economic immigration with things like the Atlantic Immigration Pilot, but really in rural areas like St. John's, maybe the focus should be more on family-sponsored immigration so that we can help those immigrants build a community. Manitoba has been really doing a lot around that. They've been really successful in bringing immigrants to rural areas because they're really building on the community that's already there. So I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I agree. So, I mean, it is so clear that retention with family class is so much higher. And our definition of family under immigration is partner and children. And that is not the world's definition of family. And you can, there are all sorts of economic benefits to having extended family. So I mean, I have written this, I think that if you, and there's some indication that some of the high refugee retention is because it's actually easier to sponsor your family as a refugee. So I absolutely think that if we're serious about retention, we should be looking at extending reunification beyond the nuclear family.
And with in terms of private sponsorship in rural areas too, what we're seeing after the whole 2015-16 Syrian resettlement piece is a lot of those families that arrived and settled and are staying here are now sponsoring their loved ones to come over through the same program. So it's not necessarily a family class, but they are sponsoring through the private sponsorship program, in many cases through the original sponsor group that brought that first family. So we're seeing, a family class rates are good, but hopefully this will help with the refugee rates as well, kind of see them go up too.
That's not really an option for non-refugees.
Can I say something quickly? I absolutely think that that's a very good question that you had. Big one. I think it's one of the biggest one we often kind of ignore, or subconsciously ignore that topic of family reunification. It's such a big one. I don't even know how much I can stretch on that point. My biggest reason to come to Newfoundland was my brother at that time, who was studying at MUN. I actually got admission in Ottawa University, but because he was living here at that time, I switched my program to, again, urban to rural. I came for that MUN University. Anyway, and I also think that, maybe that family connection program is also was a good one. I don't think we have that anymore in I'm not talking about the privately sponsored or the refugee program, especially for the international students or who become the skilled after the skill category. Under that umbrella, I'm talking the immigration umbrella, the family connection, or it used to be there before, I think. I'm not updated quite in that at this point. Anyway, but I also think that opening up that, or maybe having that chance, sometimes I feel like I wish if my sister's family was here, my integration would have been even easier, and vice versa for them too. Hence the retention again. You stay, I stay, my sister stays, Bangladesh has 165 million people. We can bring at least 30 million here, It's such a huge place. This place is huge. So, and there you go. And chances are, of course, that's the whole point of it. Immigrants, small businesses, refugees, it's all, at the end of the day, it's so much benefit to it. That's another topic. And Sherry, my colleague there, she's master of those topics. There's a huge benefit to that. We all know that. So I think good one. I'm thanking you for bringing that up. Yes, family connection, family reunification, huge.
Thank you. Before we wrap up today's session, Sherry just got a shout out, but Sherry also got in touch with me a few days ago, and they have, Sherry's with the Association for New Canadians, and they have a new film that will be screening towards the end of the month, April 24th at the Rooms, and we get a sneak peek of the trailer today. So I figured we'd take an extra 2 minutes before we wrap up entirely, and we can watch 2 minutes of a trailer. While it's loading, I'll give you the background. The film is called Home, Stories of Newcomers to Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a 25-minute documentary featuring firsthand accounts of arrival, integration, and settlement in St. John's, Gander, Corner Brook, and Labrador City. It explores overarching themes of language, community, culture in modern-day Newfoundland and Labrador. And like I said, it will be screened at the Rooms on Wednesday, April 24th at 7 p.m. And there should be some information on if registration for that on the Rooms website. If not now, by next week, they'll have that up there. I was going to say, do I turn up this sound? Program one is down. But I don't know what I'm doing. So